says How Democracy Dies. And when I started getting into it, I realized that I should narrow it down somewhat, because in 20 minutes you're not going to. So here's 3 terms that I want you to remember. There'll be a quiz afterwards. 3 terms that politicians use throughout the world. One is nativism, which is associated strongly with racism. Second term is nationalism. And the third term is religion. So I'll weave that in a little bit later on, but remember that because there'll be a quiz. So why did I pick this particular topic, immigration? Because I'm going to focus on immigration. It's because I'm an immigrant. As you may remember from my previous lectures, my parents, God bless them, they're no longer around, but they had to escape from Germany and Hungary when Hitler took over Germany and invaded Hungary eventually. And so they ran for their lives, first ending up in Portugal, and then from Portugal, having worked with the British for a while, they then went to Mozambique, which was a Portuguese colony at the time. From Mozambique, they went to South Africa. From South Africa, they went to Palestine, where yours truly was born. And 3 years later, just before the war between the Israelis and the Arabs started, they again left and went to Hungary for a year. I was 4 at the time and don't remember much about that. That's the only time I met my grandparents on my father's side. And then my parents went to France. And we stayed in France for 6 years while my parents made application to come to the United States. Why? Because my parents thought that the United States was the place for miracles, the place where people were accepted. And so we got on a ship from France. I was at that point almost 12, and we landed in New York and to pursue the American dream. And so from my perspective, democracy, open country, very important, and I tend to view everything from that particular perspective. So when I see what's going on today, naturally I'm a little bit concerned, and I think all of you should be. So immigration, one of the first things that they taught me in school when I got to the American school was that America is a great big melting pot where all peoples are accepted and incorporated and assimilated, were that to be true. I have since found in my adulthood that that's really not the case. So let's go through a little bit of immigration. All right, the first great immigration wave in America were black slaves from Africa. Between 1619 and 1850s, approximately 4.5 million blacks were brought to the United States. About 1 million of those died in transit under horrific conditions. And obviously, when they got here, they were put in slavery, working for nothing. And I think most of you know that particular story. Roughly about the same time, there were a lot of people coming from England and from Ireland, from Europe, as indentured servants, most of them. They were not landowners, they had no money, and to pay off their debts, they worked for nothing for about 7 years, and then they were allowed to do whatever, but they were white. They were not brown or black. So the next wave were the Chinese. We brought in about 350,000 Chinese from China to build the Transcontinental Railroad, at least mostly the western part of it, the Pacific Rail. And after doing that horrible labor, where more than 1,000 died in the cold and in the mountains and what have you, we completely rejected them we rejected them to the extent that Congress passed the Chinese Exclusionary Act in 1826, which forbade the Chinese here, which were mostly males, to bring their family from China. So we kept them separated. They had the choice of either staying here or not ever seeing their families again. So a lot of them left. That law was fairly draconian, so we didn't quite accept them. Then, of course, we had the Civil War, which broke up this country, and we lost 600,000 men in battle. And after the Civil War, there was a brief period of Reconstruction after the 13th and 14th Amendment were passed, where we tried to protect blacks in the South, but that lasted about 7 years. After that was over, white supremacists all over the South took over again and completely suppressed blacks in the South for the next 100 years until the 1964 Civil Rights Act and what have you. So that's another group that was not exactly accepted. Now, during the 100 years where they were suppressed in the South, about 2 million left and said goodbye and moved north. Were they accepted in the North? Not exactly. Put into ghettos, multiple riots, New York, Boston, against blacks moving into white neighborhoods and what have you. So again, the story of the great melting pot. From 1870 to about 1920, millions of Irish people came due to the famine that hit Ireland, started in the 40s, but lasted multiple years, and they were not accepted. Irish need not apply were signs all over Boston, all over New York, and there was horrendous prejudice. Why? Because they were Catholic, coming to a Protestant, mostly primarily Protestant country. I also found in my research, interestingly enough, about 2.5 million Jews moved to the United States, mostly from Eastern Europe, where, of course, they were subjected to Cossacks, pogroms, and all kinds of horrific anti-Semitism in Europe. Some of them came from Germany, but most came from the Baltic states. And Jews were relatively accepted, except quotas were put on Jews in the 1930s from the great Ivy League universities. They only accepted a very small swath, and the rest went into various medicine, what have you. Some became entrepreneurs. But anti-Semitism continued, and it is still very much alive today. So immigration has been used by politicians throughout the period that I've just described as a wedge issue. Sometimes good, sometimes to move the country forward, mostly, unfortunately, badly. Which brings us to sort of today. What are the big issues right now? We're under a state of emergency. You all know that, right? The emergency is at the southern border by executive edict of the President of the United States, who couldn't get what he wanted from Congress, and so he used what a lot of autocrats use, which is executive orders. And who remembers what the first executive order of the Trump administration was 2 years ago? Yes, sir.
The Muslim ban?
The Muslim ban. Thank you very much, Tom. And how come that? You know, again, it's part of the racial divide, and the courts twice said, no, the way it's written is not good. So what Mr. Trump had to do was broaden it beyond just Muslims, because otherwise it would have clearly been viewed as a completely discriminatory ban. So these are some of the techniques. Now, let's pivot. That's America. Let's pivot to Europe for a moment. Britain. Well, let me back up a moment. After World War II, what did Europe do? I mean, Europe had been in a state of war against each other, especially France and Germany. So after World War II, roughly around 1951, I believe, Germany and France sat down and said, we don't want to do this again. And they had barriers, trade barriers against each other, especially on coal and steel. And so what they decided to do was to eliminate those barriers over a 10-year period. And then they said, if we can get other people to join into this quote-unquote common market where we would reduce tariffs, that would be good for peace as well. And what this utopian dream finally evolved to is what we know as the European Community, the EE. Now, that's 27 countries, 17 of which use the common currency called the euro. So when you go to Europe now, you don't have to change money every time you go to Italy or France or Spain or what have you. It's all, not all of them use that, and Britain is one of the ones that opted to stay out of the euro. Why? Because Britain is a very nationalistic country. It used to have an empire, a colonial empire. It used to be a statement, the sun never sets on Britain. And of course, they lost most of that empire after colonialism dissipated. So they've always been uncomfortable not being a sovereign country. So 2 years ago, after a lot of discussion, they had a referendum on whether to leave Europe, called Brexit. And the Brexit coalition sponsored all kinds of lies about what would be involved in leaving the euro. For example, they said we no longer would have to pay $400 billion a year, which was a figure that was completely made up. But fundamentally, the main reason that Britain left Europe is because Europe has open borders. What is open borders? Anybody from the EU can go to school or work in any of the 27 countries with just their one EU passport. They don't need to make application, they don't, all kinds of stuff. Well, Britain didn't like that because one of the problems with open borders is immigrants. Immigrants also have it easier to come into the country. And right after this Brexit vote, all hell broke loose in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. Syria has been in a civil war for 7 years. In that civil war, 4 million people have been displaced, over 1 million have died, and the displaced ones have gone to Jordan, Egypt, various places in the Middle East, but more than 1 million of them got on boats and tried to get into Europe. Most landed in Greece, many of them landed in Italy, and suddenly that 1 million number became hugely controversial in Europe. It had never happened before, not to that extent. And so a lot of right-wing response, nativism. Remember that term, nativism, racism? The Syrian refugees are Islamic. They're brown, a lot of them are white. Irrespective of that, they're a different group, and they created a huge amount of backlash. Angela Merkel, to her credit, the great humanitarian, allowed 1 million of them to come into Germany. She's lost her job over that, and that has created a complete resurgence of radical groups in Germany, which previously had been banned. The neo-Nazis are coming back in Germany because of the many Muslims that she accepted into the country. Now, the rest of Europe fought that whole immigration completely. So Britain shut its borders, France shut its borders. The EU actually made a deal with Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and said, if you accept these people, we don't want them, you're a Muslim country, you take them, we'll pay you a per head for every single one that you take, which sort of helped reduce the number of Islamic immigrants getting into Europe. But they were shut off. Many Islamic people wanted to get into Britain from France, from Calais. They were shut down. Some snuck through the channel. They got into trains and what have you. These are desperate people, of course, to put it mildly. They've escaped ISIS. They've escaped the Civil War. What's going on in the Middle East right now, as we speak, is a major, major war between the Shia component of Islam and the Sunni component of Islam. The Sunnis are based out of Saudi Arabia, which is the main Sunni Mecca, and Wahhabism. They're the most conservative part of Islam, and the Shia are based in Iran, and they are fighting for supremacy in the Middle East. And there's going to be a war, I would predict, between those parties, particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia. Watch for that. They're already having proxy wars. Where? In Yemen. Yemen is being bombarded by Saudi Arabia, bombarded by Iran. Both have given troops, and it's the worst humanitarian crisis. There are some predictions that as many as 7 million people might die of famine in Yemen. So these are not good situations, and they're happening right now as we speak. So in the United States, back home, politicians have used race as a wedge issue. They've also used religion, and they've also used nationalism, although less so. Nationalism is a bigger problem in Europe than it is in the United States. But nationalism can be a positive force. This is why we pledge allegiance to the flag. It supposedly brings people together. But nationalism can be used for nasty things as well, so that one of the things politicians can do is, we are Americans, but the rest are not. That's a problem. So Donald Trump, basically, even prior to being president, for 5 years, delegitimized, or certainly attempted to delegitimize, the presidency of Barack Obama. He insisted he was from Kenya, he insisted that he was a Muslim, and this went on for 5 years, and basically never apologized for it. Of course, President Obama showed his Hawaiian birth certificate, but it didn't mean a hell of a lot to people who wanted to believe that Obama was never a legitimate president. He was our first black president, and I can basically tell you as a sociologist that President Trump is a reaction to the presidency of Barack Obama. The notion to Americans, a lot of white Americans, that a black man should